their own perspectives, but they're affecting change in the right general direction, which is to reduce the amount of animal farming we have, move towards more plant-based farming, more regenerative and organic. And when a number of organisations are working in that direction, that's when you start affecting political change. By talking about the harm that the dairy industry is doing to our planet, we help to break the social license of that industry and therefore its political influence. By keeping on making those demands to the politicians that they act to protect our rivers, to protect our drinking water, to protect our climate, and to protect animals from exploitation, we help to change the political narrative. The other thing I would say in terms of campaigning and activism is that always hold true to a values-centered position. Don't compromise what you stand for and what you believe in because you think the rest of the population is not ready to hear your radical vision. Radical is a word that's good to look up. The origin of the word radical is root. So when we talk about radical change, we mean change that goes to the roots of the problem. And what other change is any use to us? There's no use in superficial change. We need to advocate for radical change. And we need to do it in a way that brings people with us. So Nicky Hager was one of our mentors in the Native Forest Action campaign. He just got given a King's Birthday honour for his work on journalism, investigative journalism. But he said you always need to be able to communicate in a way that your auntie in Levin will understand why you're advocating for what you're advocating for. So you speak the reasons for the position you're taking, why we need fewer dairy cows, for example, in a way that everybody can understand. But you don't compromise the position you take. You advocate for that radical position. And over time, that position becomes familiar to people and becomes acceptable to people. And what you see, as with the nuclear-free movement, as with the movement for Māori land rights, as with the movement for recognition of diverse gender and identity, you see the social concept shift. You affect culture change effectively by advocating for that position. And then eventually, 1978, 30% of New Zealanders thought we should be nuclear free. By 1983, 70% of New Zealanders thought we should be nuclear free. And then by 1986, we stopped the first nuclear ship, the USS Buchanan, and we became nuclear free. That's how change happens. But you don't compromise where you stand at the outset. In fact, you never compromise where you stand. The principle on which you stand. So that's really the core of my message. And my final point, I guess I'll say, is that when you find the thing you care about, that you want to work on, and you find people who feel similarly to you about it, work with them. Get together with them. And honestly, it's a real time. Which I mean to say, it's very meaningful and it can be intense, but it's very satisfying and it can be really fun as well. Activism shouldn't be a drag, it should be something that we are excited to be part of. And then count the successes. They may seem small, but count them as they come and celebrate them. And that is the way you get to affecting big change. And there's nothing more satisfying you can do with your life. I spent 25 years doing it, and you meet the best people, and you feel like you've been part of something bigger than yourself, which is the best feeling. And you pass on something to the next generation, which is what it's about. So, kia ora koutou, and sorry for rambling, but I'm really happy to take any questions if there's time. Yeah.
Could you explain that a bit more? Like, you talk like what's culturally acceptable? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, basically, yeah. So like, for example, I've done a lot of work recently on the fertilizer industry. So synthetic nitrogen fertilizer is used to drive a whole lot of industrial farming. The dairy industry is the biggest user of it, like about 64 or 67% is used by the dairy industry. We couldn't have the level of dairy intensity without the vast volume of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer that's used. It makes the grass grow, means you can overstock the land with too many cows. It's miserable for everybody. But the fertilizer industry is such a familiar thing in the psyche of most New Zealanders. There's the Ravensdown silo by the side of the road. There's big factories all over the country. No one really notices fertilizer. People think fertilizer is a good thing. It makes plants grow, right? So to change the narrative around fertilizer, we've had to spend some years just banging on about how synthetic nitrogen fertilizer is not a good thing. It's actually a bad thing. It's bad for the environment, it's bad for animals, it's bad for the climate. And we have shifted that social license. The social license is the license that any corporation or company or government has to perpetuate an injustice or a status quo. And you have to undo that social license. And this is the other thing, is the nature of activism, is it has an element of contention and confrontation of the status quo. Do you know what I mean by status quo? Yeah. Status quo means the norm of the day, the accepted reality of the day. Activism is about challenging that. And to effect change, we have to challenge the status quo. Otherwise we're not effecting any change, right? Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Good question. Who else got a good question? You guys got a question on that head. Really?
I do.
Oh.
Let them go.
Okay, and then I've got you. Yep.
I was just wondering, so I take agriculture at my school,
Yep.
and something that we learn is about how important it is to keep dairy as a primary industry in New Zealand because it is our biggest income earner.
Yep.
How do you think that we can change it and make it more sustainable? Because I don't know if the country will listen to reducing it so much that it reduces our income, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, be careful of who is feeding the narrative, is what I would say. Do you know what I mean by that? Like, who is saying, oh, we can't possibly change this because the whole world will fall apart if we change this. If we change the status quo. Dairy is a massively influential industry, and it probably has the biggest lobbying power of any industry in New Zealand. And it successfully convinces the two major political parties to not change anything. So if we were to shift to more plant-based production in Aotearoa New Zealand and have a lot fewer dairy cows like we used to have, and perhaps no dairy cows one day, what would happen? What if instead of producing lots of dairying down Southland, we produced more oats and barley instead? What if we shifted more to arable farming like they used to produce on the Canterbury Plains? Will not that be profitable? Will not that provide jobs and farm gate profits for the farmers? But instead of farming cows, they're farming oats, which could be turned into oat milk, God forbid. And so this idea that if you change the status quo, it's going to break everything. That's a classic establishment narrative. The establishment will always say you can't possibly change this. And we always have to question that, because we now have 5 or 6 million dairy cows. In 1990, we had about half as many dairy cows. We had way more sheep. So in the last 30 years, there's been a massive transformation of land use. Why the next 30 years, from here forward, has to be a massive transition of land use, away from animal farming, if we are to have swimmable rivers, a stable climate, and drinkable water, and an end to the misery of intensively farmed animals. So I would just say that old thing, it ain't necessarily so. Like, just never accept what's presented on face value. Have a critical mind to whether, is that actually true? Who is saying that, and why are they saying that, and what do they stand to lose if something changes? The dairy industry will always tell you we can't possibly touch dairy. Yeah.
Well, I also
100%. And who's actually paying the cost? The environment, the animals. Right now, I've done a lot of work in nitrate contamination of drinking water, which mostly comes from dairy cane, urine, and fertilizer. It gives people cancer. Like, the evidence is mounting on that. It causes preterm birth in pregnant people. So, like, it's making people sick. And so, who's paying the cost of that? You know. You got time for that question?
Yeah, how do you keep your tenacity? You've been doing this for around 25 years, you said.
Yeah.
There's obviously been moments where it feels like there's no progress being made. How do you manage that in those times?
What else am I going to do? Actually, you know, the weird thing is once I had that experience of native forest action that we could make change happen, you can't unknow that. And actually, you have to. Then you can't sit there and go, oh, that stink, I wish I could do something about that. You actually now go, oh, well, I can do something about that, so maybe I should do something about it. But also the gaps of not having success, actually that's the amazing thing, there hasn't really been that.
Oh, wow.
Like, what turns out is that if you manage to effectively organize and you can grow a movement or be part of a movement, it takes many, many people and you're always only one part of it. You can affect change. Like, we basically got a de facto moratorium on genetically engineered crops in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We stopped the Marsden coal-fired power station they were going to build in 2005. We stopped native logging back in '99. We stopped the opening of conservation estate to mining in about 2010. And then we ran the 7-year campaign against offshore oil and gas exploration, working with Te Whānau Apanui initially and then other iwi around the country. And we got a ban on new offshore oil and gas exploration in 2017, 2018. So there's actually been these constant wins along the way. So it works. I wouldn't do it if it didn't work. But it's probably a good segue to, I'm also standing for Parliament this year for the Greens. And I feel like it's time for me to prove or try and test why is it that politicians can't do the right thing, because I think they should be able to. And so I'm having a go at doing that. And I would just say as a plug for the Greens that it's good to be involved in this political process as well, the conventional political process. If you're 17, you can enroll. And if you're 18 on the 14th of October, you can vote. And I'd really encourage you to vote. But also to say that the Green Party has the kind of most deeply thought policy and positions on questions of animal protection, questions of climate change, the environment, and social justice. And I would strongly invite you to be part of the Green Party organising. That's a little political plug. Is that me?
Right on time.